Well, welcome to the first show in the Walking with Walt series.
Oh.
While we were doing Christmas at Disneyland, we took the...
It's Walking in Walt's Disneyland Footprints.
That's
Yes.
really...
Yes,
That's,
say that
ah,
fast. 5 times.
I don't know who came up with that name, but it's a great tour.
It is, it's
You
wonderful.
just call the VIP scheduling thing deal number, and they'll set you up for that. And a guide takes small groups of people through Disneyland, the whole park, and they take you on a few of the rides, but mostly they explain the history and Walt's direct involvement with it. Disneyland is, after all, the only Disney theme park that Walt Disney ever set foot in.
Yeah.
And he had his little apartment there and everything, which we've sort of talked about. So this week we're going to talk about the history of the railroad.
Oh, nice.
Because 4 years ago, this is also the 4th anniversary of the show.
Yes, I found that out. I'm looking at the calendar and go, oh,
Whoa, 256 or whatever it shows. Anyway, so we're revisiting, because the very first show was on the Disneyland Railroad as well. So we're revisiting that a little more in depth with a lot more history about Disney's endless screwing around, building Disneyland, and his propensity for playing with toy trains.
Yes.
And some of the other people that he worked with, the animators at the studio, who kind of drug him in that direction. So, Walking with Walt, the history of the railroad. Check it out. So after we took the tour, we decided to go off and see what original rides we could find. Now, Disney animator, one of the old original 9 animators, Ward Kimball, had just a tremendous effect on the design of Disneyland. Ward Kimball loved everything 19th century. He collected automated musical instruments and convinced Disney to have a penny arcade full of automated musical instruments. Fantasyland here is truly a Walt Disney area, and it's where the carousel is, and to some extent Disneyland owes its entire existence to a carousel. But one of the most original rides at the park is the railroad. So let's go scope out the railroad. Now, inside Main Street Station is a recreation of Walt's engine, the Lilly Bell, again, a really important part of Disneyland history. Now, just across the street from the train station is Walts Apartment. How far would you say?
About 300 feet, maybe?
300 feet over to the apartment and the train station. So Walt could just walk over here when he wanted to run a train. Now, it's not a coincidence that the apartment ends up above the fire department. Here again, Ward Kimball was into collecting fire engines and fire engine memorabilia. He had a Dixieland band, which he called the Firehouse 5+2.
Why do you call it the Firehouse 5+2? I never did understand that.
Because there's 7 of us.
At any rate, the fire station ends up being sort of a museum to early fire apparatus, and there's a fire pole up to Disney's apartment. Now, Walt Disney stayed here a lot during the construction phase, but later on he seemed to enjoy having his grandkids over. I mean, I understand that. Grandkids
are a lot of fun.
A lot of fun, and it was sure neat for us to just walk into Disney's life this way and to see where he and Lily entertained the grandkids and even the baby bottles that they fed them with. It was just so wonderful.
I grew up watching Walt Disney shows, the cartoons and the movies, and it was a real honor to stand here in his apartment.
It was an emotional experience.
It was.
It's also kind of fun that there's this railroad memorabilia around because Walt was just really, really, really into trains. But that fascination had really been strengthened by the other rail fanatics that worked for him at the studio. The railroad was so important to Walt that he decided to incorporate it as a separate company so that he would own the railroad himself, not the corporation. And one of the most influential friends there was again Ward Kimball.
Well, one of my hobbies, Groucho, is trains.
Trains, huh? Well, electric or a wind-up?
No, I have 3 full-size Baldwin locomotives and 4 big coaches
In the house?
in my backyard.
Ward Kimball had built an entire railroad on his 3-acre piece of property in Glendale. He called it the Grizzly Flats Railroad. And Ward's wife, Betty, was maybe even a bigger train nut than he was. It is, after all, okay for girls to play with trains too, right?
Mm-hmm.
Now, in 1938, Ward drug the first piece of equipment home. That was this Carson and Colorado coach. But it was Betty who bought the locomotive. It was Nevada Central number 400, and they brought it here and turned it into the Emma Nevada. Now, because of Ward's fascination with anything pre-20th century, he painted it to look like a 19th century locomotive. Lots of pinstriping and murals. And the next thing that Ward drug home was this, the Grizzly Flats Depot. It was actually just a train station set from a movie, and Ward had to turn it into an actual structure. Originally, it was just 3 walls and a roof. It was used in this film, so dear to my heart, and that is Virginia and Truckee engine number 22. Anyway, Ward went to work building an entire interior for this and a back wall and putting in heating and all the things you have to do to make it a functional train depot. Sort of reminds me of Garage Mahal.
Yeah, the clock looks familiar.
Isn't it? It's the same clock. The railroad was built on 3 acres of land, which was kind of just a strip of land, and that gave Ward a chance to put in about 500 feet of track up the strip of land here to the street. The Grizzly Flats Depot is right here at the midpoint. There's also this really large garage here to house the antique automobiles and fire trucks. And over here, a 3-stall engine house that could hold all 3 of his locomotives and the coach. Here we have the water tank, and next to the water tank is a railroad-style windmill that used to fill the water tank. But this whole area was incredibly rural farmland back in the 1930s when Ward Kimball started putting this together. Over time, of course, being Southern California, it built up and it built up into the city of Glendale that we know today. Now, as would be expected, there were a lot of different people who showed up to just sort of hang around and tinker with the trains and screw around with the trains. One of them was rail historian Gerald Best, who did more than just screwing around with the trains. He showed up one day with his own locomotive. And over time, he completely restored this little locomotive there on Ward Kimball's railroad. He was in the business of finding locomotives and then selling them to the motion picture studios. One of his most amazing acquisitions was Eureka and Palisades number 4, which he found in a scrapyard in the Bay Area and sold that to Warner Brothers to use in movies. Subsequently, Dan Markoff in Las Vegas got a hold of it and completely restored it to operating condition. Now, one of his favorite things to resurrect were these little plantation engines that he found in Hawaii or sometimes in the South, and these could be turned into all manner of other types of locomotives. This one came off the same plantation that his locomotive came off of, and he got this one for Ward Kimball, who turned it into a locomotive he called the Chloe.
That is just stinking cute.
You know, normally I try to avoid the cute word when describing a locomotive, but
Hey,
when it comes to these two, I'll go with cute. They're fine.
they are darling.
And Walt Disney particularly loved the Olomana here. He said it was incredibly Mickey Mouse.
Oh,
That's his word for cute. He said if Mickey had a locomotive, that would be the one right there. And they were really popular with people, more than the big engine. Ward Kimball would have these open houses, and these were the 2 trains that people wanted to screw around with. Now, another of the original 9 animators at the studio was Ollie Johnston, and Ollie was also a complete over-the-top train nut. In his backyard, he had constructed a 1/12 scale railroad, just barely big enough to ride on. This was actually modern equipment when he built this. Now, where this looks like it was a tremendous amount of fun for him,
I think he was getting just a little bit jealous of these guys with the great big trains, and he wanted one too. So Jerry Best got him a plantation engine, and he turned it into this engine, the Marie E. Does that place look familiar?
Yes, it does.
That's Rob's ranch. That's the Santa Margareta Ranch. There's a lot of fun operating up there. They call it the Pacific Coast Railroad, and there's a lot of Disney equipment there. Now this guy here is Chad O'Connor, and he did not work for the Disney Studios, but he worked with them a lot. He had an engineering company and a machine shop, and he loved to film trains with his 16mm camera. So he constructed this little gadget here. It's a fluid head for his tripod, and it's full of hydraulic fluid, and it dampens all the movements of the camera so that it doesn't shake. Absolutely great for filming trains. Well, he was shooting one day at a train station, and a voice came from behind and said, "How the heck does that thing work? And can you build me 2 of them for my movie studio?" Only then did he realize that it was Walt Disney. Well, he not only built Disney 2 of these, he went right on building them, and they're still made to this day, the O'Connor fluid head for tripods. They sell for thousands of dollars, but they are one of the finest camera mount systems you can find. Now, in the early 1970s, long after Disneyland was up and running, O'Connor was contracted by the Parks Department to build these 2 replica locomotives for the Golden Spike National Historic Monument. And they were constructed right there in O'Connor's engineering company. He hired a bunch of the Disney people to help, most notably here Ward Kimball, who had done a lot of the mural work on his own locomotive, the Emma Nevada, and that turned out so nice that he figured that he would be able to handle all of the mural work on the Union Pacific 119, which had some fairly elaborate murals on it. And anyway, who better than a Disney animator? Here we see Ward Kimball painting Johnny Appleseed onto the side of the sand dome for Union Pacific 119. And the Disney Art Department also handled all of the lettering and pinstriping on these 2 locomotives as well. And then, of course, there's Walt Disney himself, who had built his own ride-on railroad in his backyard, this time a 1/8 scale railroad running on 7.5-inch gauge track. The railroad's one and only locomotive was called the Lilly Bell. He named it after his wife, and it was constructed by this guy, one of the machinists at the studio, Roger Brogy. And so then Roger Brogy becomes one of these foaming rail fans hanging out with the animators and these other characters who were playing trains. One of the few survivors from this period is the kid in this photo, Michael Brogy, Roger's son. And Michael Brogy has written several books on this subject and has an organization called the Carrollwood Society to preserve this history. Well, Walt Disney was having a ball playing with his railroad. He liked to invite people over to sort of experience the whole thing. He tried to operate the railroad just about every Sunday and had people come over, of course, by invitation. Now, famously, Walt Disney liked to take his daughters to Griffith Park to ride on this carousel. And while they rode the carousel, he would sit on this park bench watching them and envisioning some sort of an amusement park where it would be just as entertaining for the adults as the children. And what could be more entertaining to adults than a train ride?
Absolutely.
So he and Ward Kimball started playing with the idea of building a train with a carousel on land just across the street from the studio. And the 2 of them traveled off together to the Ford Museum and a place there called Greenfield Village. Greenfield Village wasn't really an amusement park, but it kind of came off as one, and it had a ring railroad that went all the way around the outside of it, and I think that idea really stuck with these guys. Now, I want you to pay very special attention to those passenger cars. They're really, really easy to get in and out of, and the people riding the train can get in and out of them quickly. Well, in 1954, Walt Disney suddenly found himself with $17 million from the ABC television network to finance the park. Well, he went to work constructing the 2 locomotives that they were going to use on the railroad. They actually built them themselves right there at Disneyland. They hired Wilmington Iron Works to cast the frames and Dixon Boilers to construct the boilers. They constructed 2 different train stations. This is, of course, the Main Street station at the main gate. 2 stations for 2 trains because they sort of envisioned this being 2 different train rides. Do you recognize that?
Sure do.
That's the Grizzly Flats Depot. Now, it didn't have the little passenger platforms on it when they built it. It was just exactly like Ward Kimball's. In fact, Disney tried to talk him out of the Grizzly Flats Depot, and Ward Kimball said, no way. So he just built his own. Later on, they also built this really cool freight depot. And we might want to think about building one of those to go along with your Grizzly Flats model.
Absolutely.
Now, this was known as the Frontierland Depot. Now it's called the New Orleans Square Depot, but we all know and love it as the Grizzly Flats Depot. Now, if you listen carefully, you can hear the telegrapher tapping away on the key here, sending out Morse code. And what he's sending out is Walt Disney's dedication speech when he opened Disneyland. Now, here again in 1955, they just had the 2 trains. This is engine number 1, the CK Holiday. And if you look closely, it's the Lilly Bell. The Lilly Bell was based on a Central Pacific locomotive, Central Pacific 117. And this is the same engine, only this time in a 5/8 scale, so that it will run on 3-foot gauge track. And it looks like it's pulling a freight train. The train that this locomotive pulled looked like a freight train from the right side of the train, but it was open on the left side of the train so the people riding in there could see out. And they sat sideways looking into the park. Now, this train only left from the Frontierland station. Now, the other locomotive, the number 2 locomotive, the EP Ripley, always left from the Main Street station, and it pulled actual railroad coaches. They were based on some 3-foot gauge coaches that Disney had seen at Travel Town in Griffith Park. Now, in the very beginning, these 2 trains would actually pass each other at the train stations. The EP Ripley would pull into the Main Street station, and while it was picking up and dropping off passengers, the freight train would pass it on the siding and continue on to Frontierland Station. At Frontierland Station, the freight train would stop at the station, and the passenger train would pass it on the siding. As people paid a fare to ride the train, they wanted to make sure that everybody got off at the same station they got on at. Now, Walt Disney, of course, loved screwing around with the trains, and that meant actually running them. So on the days when he wanted to run a train, he would get up at his apartment and head over to the Main Street station, and that meant he would get into this train, the Fred Gurley, the number 2 locomotive. So he'd put on his locomotive engineer outfit and come over and grab this train and pull passengers around without them ever knowing that it was Walt Disney running the train. It's actually fairly easy to envision Walt sitting here in the engineer's seat running this little guy. Now, had he wanted to run the number 1 engine, the one that looked like his engine, the Lilly Bell, he would have had to have walked over to the Frontierland station to pick up that train. So this one was just a lot more convenient. Now, back in here we can see the locomotive shops. These had to be completely rebuilt in the 1960s as they had added 2 more trains, and they needed a bigger facility. The railroad currently has 4 complete trains and 5 locomotives, and these shops are big enough to hold all 5 locomotives and all the passenger trains inside. Now, this begs the question, just where did these other trains and locomotives come from? The park was so successful they desperately needed 2 more trains on the railroad. So in 1958, Roger Brogy converted a plantation engine into the number 3 here, the Fred Gurley. As soon as that train was finished, he went to work on the number 4, the Ernest S. Marsh, also built out of another plantation engine. In 2005, another plantation engine was converted into a locomotive, the number 5, this time named after Ward Kimball, who had had such an influence on the design of this entire railroad. This gives them a spare locomotive in case one of the locomotives is completely torn down for rebuilding and servicing. The number 2, or E.P. Ripley, is actually a model of Baltimore and Ohio 774 in 5/8 scale. It was designed by Jerry Best, who said that would be a really appropriate locomotive to pull the passenger train.
Those little locomotives look just like jewelry. They belong in a jewelry box, actually.
They're gorgeous. They're positively amazing. Now, this particular consist of cars is called the excursion cars, and do those look familiar?
They do.
That's the same kind of cars they were using at Greenfield Village that were so easy to get in and out of. These cars actually replaced the original coach cars because they were really hard to get in and out of. This is the Holiday Blue train. There are 3 holiday trains, red, which you can see to the left, blue, and green, which you can see to the right. The red holiday train is actually the old freight train, really unaltered to this day, still pulling its iconic caboose. Because that train was always pulled by the C.K. Holiday, this design was dubbed the Holiday design. And it works so darn well that they just built 3 versions of it. Except that the green and blue trains do not have a caboose. Only the old original train, Holiday Red, which was originally called Retlaw 2. The original 2 trains were Retlaw 1 and Retlaw 2. Retlaw is just Walter spelled backwards. But if the train that pulls up to the station is Retlaw 2, feel free to grab a ride on the caboose. They just leave it open so you can get in there. So, of course, that's exactly what we did. We grabbed a ride on the caboose.
The caboose is my favorite car anyway. I wouldn't mind having a caboose, maybe for a cabin.
Now, the original passenger train from 1955 was called Retlaw 1, and there's only 1 car left here on the railroad. It was originally an observation car, but in 1970 it was converted into a parlor car and renamed the Lilly Bell. Now, they don't run this car every day, but they quite typically will put it on a train on Friday, and if you get permission, you can ride it. Now, 4 of the other passenger cars are up on Rob Rossi's railroad, the Pacific Coast Railroad in Santa Margareta. When they decided to get rid of these cars because they were so hard to get in and out of, well, Rob bought them and brought them here to his ranch. Now, Rob's ranch is not open to the public. He just has it for screwing around. But he does open it to the public 1 day a year on Memorial Day. And they have a huge event up here called the Best of the West Antique Equipment Show. That's a mouthful.
No kidding, but there's a lot of machinery.
It's really neat. We went last year and we had a ball. Now there's 3 and sometimes 4 steam locomotives on this railroad. These 2 are leftovers from movie studios. They were converted out of smaller locomotives. And 4 of the retired passenger cars are up here on Rob's ranch: the Navajo Chief, the Painted Desert, the Land of Pueblos, and the Colorado Rockies. Now, there was also a combine car on this train, and that car is preserved at the LA Live Steamers in Griffith Park. Now, you have to admit, Rob Rossi really knows how to screw around. Now, when we were at Disneyland for Christmas this year, we saw something truly amazing. The CK Holiday here was pulling the original freight train, Retlaw 2. So what you see here is exactly what you would have seen in 1955, except that it wouldn't have been pulling out from Main Street Station. Now, if you wanted to go looking for any of the original track or grade, you're not going to find very much of the original track. Most of the track is in its original location, but not all. The passing siding is still in at Main Street Station, and that's probably about all the original track you will find. The switches have been removed, and it's no longer connected to the main. And the passing track at the Grizzly Flats Depot has been totally removed. In 1972, there was a major realignment of the track when they built a trestle to pass over the entrance to Bear Country. And the train now passes through several major attractions: Pirates of the Caribbean, the Haunted Mansion, Splash Mountain, and It's a Small World. But the absolute biggest change to the railroad happened just this year. In 2016 and 17, the whole rear area of the Rivers of America was reshaped, and this huge trestle system was put in to carry the trains along this new divider, which separates the Rivers of America from the new Star Wars land on the other side. It's a really impressive trestle system, and it's got a sort of bridge in the middle here. This is where the fantastic floats emerge for the water parade. The original railroad was 1.2 miles long, and surprisingly, this change hasn't added or subtracted any appreciable footage from that. And check out this neat steel bridge over the entrance to Star Wars Land. And you might wonder what became of the Carrollwood Pacific here in Walt's backyard. Well, unfortunately, it's long gone. There is a replica of the Lilly Bell on display in the Main Street Station, but the real locomotive is still owned by the Disney family. The barn on the railroad was moved to the LA Live Steamers layout in Griffith Park, where it resides to this day, not far at all from the carousel where Disney dreamt this whole thing up. Now, before he passed away, Ward Kimball started moving part of the Grizzly Flats Railroad to the Orange Empire Museum in Paris, California. And the Chloe is here, and the neat little open-air car is here. Also, the giant coach that Ward had is here. It does show some of the ravages of time. Keep in mind that Ward fixed this thing up in 1938. And so it looks like it's been around, but the volunteers here at the museum are very carefully and very lovingly restoring the car back to its original glory. And the Emma Nevada is here as well. It also shows some of the ravages of time, but it's not in really bad shape, no longer operational, of course, and I don't think there are any plans to try to get it operational. And because the Olomana was restored, not altered, Gerald Best donated it to the Smithsonian Institution, and they have it on display there in Washington, D.C. Still looking incredibly Mickey Mouse, as Walt Disney would say. And Ollie Johnson sold the Marie E. to John Lasseter, the head of Disney Creative. He has also moved the Grizzly Flats Depot and water tank up to his railroad, which he calls the Justy Creek Railway. John Lasseter actually started at Disneyland as a ride host. He was one of the boat operators on the Jungle Cruise. That's right, he used to shoot mechanical hippopotamuses with a fake gun. He eventually ended up at Industrial Light and Magic, where he met Steve Jobs and Ed Catmull, and the three of them formed Pixar. When they reopened the railroad in 2017, he brought his engine, Ollie Johnson's old engine, the Marie E, up. They also brought the Chloe and the little open-air car up from the Orange Empire Museum and towed those around with the Marie E. What a great way to reopen the railroad. Now, as I say, Lassiter moved the Grizzly Flats depot and the water tank up to his railroad, but 2017 was not a good year, was the worst year for fires in California history, and unfortunately, both of these structures were destroyed.
Well, there you go, the Walt Disney Railroad,
That was wonderful.
the Retlaw Railroad. And who knew all that history and the Grizzly Flats Railroad
Right.
and Holly Johnston's railroads and John Lassiter. Just some absolutely amazing history with the Disneyland Railroad.
Right.
And next week we're going to pick the story up again and we're going to look at the Mark Twain riverboat
Oh boy.
because it kind of ties into the railroad in
It
an
does.
interesting sort of way.
Yes.
Same kind of people build it and so on and so forth. And it was the only other ride at Disneyland that Disney personally owned.
Right.
That and the railroad. The rest of it belonged to the corporation. So anyway, that'll be next week's show. Well, if you haven't been over to the channel, do pop on over to the channel. And if you're not a subscriber, please subscribe. First of all, you get notified every time we upload something, so that's cool for you. And we get to see how many people have subscribed to the channel, and
Right.
that's really cool for us.
Yes.
So do subscribe. And the way to do that is to click on the blue button, zoink! You see the blue button over here, says subscribe. Takes you to the channel, makes you a subscriber. You can click on it anytime you want.
Right.
It won't double subscribe you
No,
or anything like
be
that.
nice if it did.
But yeah, that'd be okay. But it doesn't. Well, we're not sure how you found this movie on the internet. We hope you didn't find it boring. And we will see you here again next week with the Mark Twain Riverboat. See ya.
Bye.
Bye-bye.